Hi, everyone. Everyone can take their seats. Thanks a lot. We've got an exciting panel for all of you here today on a topic that I don't think gets a lot of attention many times until it's too late. Of course, that issue is fraud, and as you can see, the name of our presentation here is to stop them before they strike. Successful fraud management techniques for digital goods. Got some great panelists here today. I am Michael Liberty. I am the manager of New Ventures Risk, focusing on digital goods at PayPal. We have Ohad Sumet, who is the resident magician at Analyzed, and also was formerly with PayPal managing the New Ventures Risk practice. Nelson Ho, who has an extensive background in fraud management at Electronic Arts, built their fraud management practice there. And Mike Robleski, he is the director of fraud and risk at GSN Digital, world winner, with over 10 years of experience working in this area. The agenda for today is fraud basics, starting with Ohad Sumet. Then we'll be moving into dealing with fraud, and then we're going to move into a Q&A type format that I think will be the most enjoyable part of the presentation, where we'll open it up for audience questions, and anything you want to talk about with respect to fraud we'll address. So with that, I'm going to handle it off to Ohad, who's going to take you through the basics of fraud.
Hi, everyone. Fraud basics. First, a minute of why should you care. A lot of organizations deal with fraud after they begin to experience fraud. They begin to experience chargebacks, returns, etc. And the first reaction is, well, I have bad orders. I just throw a few people at it and it'll go away. Wrong. But most organizations learn that in the hard way. And to understand how you should structure the way you think about fraud, it's important to understand a few basics about it. And that's why it's interesting, and that's why we're starting from basics. What do we mean when we say fraud? So every time there's an incentive in a system, there's going to be a player or an actor trying to circumvent the system and get the incentive without going through the process of getting it legitimately. And that's an important piece, because the type of incentive that you're going to give users in your system, in your website, in your app, is going to determine the type of fraud that you're going to face. So you could look at intentional fraud, where people lie about their identity, they steal other people's identity. And you can look at friendly fraud, where people use their own identity but abuse the system, deny payments, etc. And multiple types of patterns and behaviors that users present when in your system under these categories. What's friendly fraud? So basically, friendly fraud is a misnomer. When we talk about fraud, we generally mean someone who reaches a site with malicious intent. But when you look at friendly fraud, it's usually not the case. People use their own identity to make payments, and at some point in time, something happens, and that something triggers a chain reaction that ends up with a return, with a chargeback, with a complaint. And this is not a standard identity fraud scenario. This person did not come to your site with malicious intent. Something happened along the way, and we need to think about ways of dealing with the change that occurred to that user on your website that triggered that abuse pattern, that friendly fraud pattern. So a few very basic, very suggestions you can take is, first of all, messaging. Right? Being clear when clicking means paying, and reducing double clicks. A lot of friendly fraud scenarios just emerge from people trying to make a payment and just getting lost in the payment process, not knowing if they completed a process and not completing a process, doing it twice, and not understanding that they're paying for something. That you may not mean it to happen, but it happens. You need to optimize a new process for people to understand what they're doing in every step of the way. Beware of scam offers. That's a standard business practice. But when you try to monetize and you find yourself choosing any type of monetization option around, be sure that you vet it. Be sure that you understand what you're putting on your site. Be sure that you're not creating a way for your users to feel like they've been scammed, or that there's been something that you have done or that a partner that you integrated with has done to scam them or to double-click them or auto-enroll them or incur hidden charges, because you will experience a backlash. And the third thing is knowing and interacting with your big spenders. You will see whales in your system. You will see people making a lot of payments and coming back and again to make repeating transactions. And you want to be in touch with these people. You don't want to just let them go and go about making multiple payments, because some of these people will end up regretting what they do. And a lot of times when you think about conversion, we end up saying whatever makes them not think and click the button and make a payment is good. Mostly it is good for the business because people make payments, but if you just let it go and you don't control what people do on your website and you don't communicate with them, you end up with a lot of reversed orders where people who end up in the end of the month seeing the charge, regretting some of the payments they did, and charging back and leaving you to deal with the friendly fraud results. Now, why do people defraud? They defraud for many reasons, and it's important to understand. I mean, this slide is very simplistic. Yes, from financial gain for the challenge to get ahead in the game. It's very simplistic, but it illuminates a very basic fact. When fraud happens on your site, you should do whatever you can to understand what was the mechanic of fraud and what was the reason, what was the story behind the fraud case. Because understanding why something happened, what are the incentives that drive a user to defraud on your site, and how they did what they did, will shed a lot of lights on how you need to build a system or the next rule or the next model to deal with the type of fraud that you just experienced. So understand why people defraud on your site, understand what's the incentive they need to, they're trying to get to be able to prevent fraud in the future. Now, focusing on identity fraud, there's an obvious basic truth. The fraudsters that come to your site and provide you with an identity, with a credit card, with a name, with an address, etc., are not the people they steal from. They stole this identity, they stole this credit card or the credentials for an account from a user. It sounds very obvious, it sounds very simple, but this is something you can use to detect fraud. It means that while some actions are just bad, and you can see that by using a lot of fraud tools that are out there in the market, marking devices and IPs that fraudulent orders came from. Some of these orders can be tracked in other systems using a blacklist of IPs, but most of the times actions are bad in context. They're not just bad as it is. You cannot just block away a country or block away a whole segment of the population and expect your fraud problem to go away. And at the same time, if you do that, you turn away a lot of good volume. So a good example is Nigerian IPs or buyers placed in Nigeria. Statistically, if you look at the numbers, if a Nigerian IP, a Nigerian user, or a user connecting from a Nigerian IP uses a US credit card to make a payment, 97% of these payments empirically are usually fraud. But at the same time, if a Nigerian user uses a Nigerian card, you see 98% of the orders are legitimate. It shows you that you can never single out one indicator and build your whole system on that specific indicator, on a blacklist of IPs, on a blacklist of addresses, on a list of countries you don't allow users to make a payment from. You need to understand what type of users visit your site, what does fraud look like, and use that to make sensible decisions on the business that you allow on your site and the orders that you decline and the orders that you approve. And understanding the context, as said here, is key for fraud prevention. And there are a few resources. There are a lot of resources that you can use, but a few resources that are used by multiple merchants to look at the context and understand it. Now, when we look at identity fraud techniques, as I mentioned, we see two prevalent identity fraud techniques. One is takeover. If you have an account with stored value, and that value could be anything. It could be monetary value, it could be virtual goods, it could be a person's reputation, it could be a person's social graph that can be used to spam or scam their friends. You see a lot of account takeover. Compromised credentials, targeted attacks, targeted at getting credentials for your system for users to take over your account and then either use it themselves or sell it to other users. And the other type of fraud that you see is identity fraud. It's the case where someone's details are stolen and used to open an account and initiate payments or initiate a relationship with you in your website. They differ. What do they differ? First of all, the way fraudsters get the access and data is different. And while, for example, when they steal identities, they steal a bulk of credit cards with name, addresses, etc. In the way accounts that are taken over are monetized is different. Fraudsters visit these accounts to look at the balance and what they contain before they can value them for resale. The pattern of access of users that you see in an account like that is essentially different than an account that is opened by a fraudster. The second thing is that there's a valuable history and context. When you see account takeover, you usually have history to compare to. You have context on your website that you can compare to, that you can say, this user never connected from this type of IP, never did this type of action, etc., and you can play with the type of actions or the type of risk that you allow suspected users in existing accounts. As I said previously, in new accounts with stolen identities, you don't have context in your website to understand what's good and what's bad. And most merchants stop at that. They don't have any context. They place a lot of limitations, a lot of velocity limitations on new users. Don't let them make a lot of payments, and have them build a reputation a long time. Well, this is an interesting approach. It limits a lot of good users that want to operate on your system. So there's a lot of complexity here in the data that's available for you to make a decision. And as I mentioned, based on these two items, detection and prevention tools are obviously different, and your detection approach needs to differ between these two types of approaches or these two types of fraud techniques. I'll hand it off to Mike.
So how do we actually deal with fraud? Ohad went into some of the techniques that you can utilize, but we'll get into a little more detail, mostly in the panel, but just to cover a few things. To start, what does PayPal do for you in the first place? A lot of people don't realize this, but PayPal is doing transaction-level evaluation on every single transaction that comes through our system. So we're not sampling or anything like that. We're reviewing every single transaction. And specifically around digital goods, we spent a lot of time building out our detection techniques where we have separate segments of our model, rules that are focused on digital goods, so we can do a better assessment, reduce our false positive rates, and reduce our declines. We also look at accounts in general. As Ohad mentioned, we're looking for consistency between the account, and we're monitoring the account on the aggregate level. It informs our decisions about the transaction and also lets us make better decisions about the whole account. And then, because PayPal obviously is such a large organization where we're seeing millions and millions of transactions coming through and millions of users, we're doing network assessment across accounts and looking for repeating patterns between the accounts linking them based on IP addresses or other things that we see, so we can take that wide picture, which you guys might not have available to you as an individual merchant. And lastly, we have a resolution center that is focused on resolving issues that you guys might not have the bandwidth to do, in particular with our new digital goods product. And we design out our flows around specific products such that we're handling those appropriately. But that doesn't mean you can't do anything on top of PayPal. You know your business better than anyone, and there's certain customizations that you can make, and our panelists will talk about this, that are going to help us, and our functions can be complementary. As I said, we handle hundreds of millions of transactions, and that helps us when we're doing our network assessments. But if we're talking about a small merchant, right, you could see things that are very, very particular to your business that we might miss amongst all those transactions. So really what we want to do is build a complementary relationship where your techniques work off ours as well. And really, we're dependent on you guys. There are some things that we do on our end and with our models that are rendered moot if you are, not putting the work in on your side. So, with that in mind, what we would say is, once you start growing to scale, the most important thing to keep folks like Mike and Nelson in business certainly is you should hire a risk lead. Right, and what we're saying is, kind of best practices, and everyone has different opinions on this, is once your business starts growing to about 15 to 20 people, and really when you start to get traction with some of your products, you're going to start to become a target of fraudsters, and this tends to coincide when your product is hit success, right, and you're starting to build scale. So you hire an in-house person to learn your business, because they'll know it, again, better than us on that detailed level, and they'll be able to make those kind of recommendations. And what you'll see here with our panel is what some of those recommendations can be. So we're going to call them up, Mike, Ohad, and Nelson. Come on up, guys. As I mentioned, Mike is from Game Show Network and World Winner, over 10 years experience in fraud and risk management. Nelson comes to us from Electronic Arts, where he basically built their fraud management practice there from scratch. And Ohad, as I mentioned, had a background at Fraud Sciences, which was an acquisition PayPal made several years ago, where he was focusing on a lot of behavioral modeling, and now he has his own fraud consulting and risk consulting business. So I'm going to break the ice, but after that we'll move into questions. You pose your question, I'll repeat it, and then I'll pose it to one of the panelists. So I guess the first question, and we'll start off with Mike here. Mike, what were some of the challenges that you saw maybe in the years when you started out in fraud versus what you're seeing today, both in overall industry development in digital goods and what small companies might see versus large?
Well, I just think overall, from a volume perspective, it's just much more difficult to deal with these days than it was when I started 15 years ago. A very popular means of compromising information 15 years ago might involve someone diving in a dumpster behind a bank after the bank closes to compromise information that they might find. Those methods are just simply antiquated at this point. A perfect example would be the data breach at TJX, where millions of account information and social security numbers and so on get compromised now in larger volumes, and that information is shared and distributed much more easily than it ever has been in the past. There are communities, and with the boom of social networking, there are communities that are developing on the internet that are designed specifically for sharing of this information. So the challenge at this point has evolved where it's just much more difficult to keep up with the volume. It's much more difficult to track the fraudsters. They're located at all four corners of the earth. And it's difficult to keep them out of your environment permanently. So that's what I would say is how this has evolved in the last 15 years or so.
Yeah, to add to that, I mean, overall, it's not about trying to eliminate the fraud. I mean, the idea is to reduce it as much as possible. I think one of the challenges that we had was, fraud for us wasn't that big of a deal early on because we were really into the packaged goods. It was all on the retailer side to deal with that. But as we moved to the digital market and direct to consumer, and being EA being the merchant of record, we were seeing a lot of fraud. And the thing is that fraud is almost like disaster recovery. Nobody cares about it until it actually happens. And so when we finally did get hit with a substantial amount of fraud, the biggest issue was that no one knew, and being such a big company, nobody knew who to go to. And I think the issue was that the fraud actually went on for about 3 to 4 months until the amount got so high that someone finally raised a red flag to it. So one of the things is, getting an understanding of your business and understanding, how fraud could actually happen is definitely, and then communicating it out to the management as well too, and of course getting their buy-in is always a great thing. The other challenges is that I now work closely with our legal team, customer service, accounting. I mean, I utilize their help and resources to help actually develop the fraud program because there's a lot of processes that I implement that hopefully I'm not breaking any laws, so I need to include the legal team. CS is definitely a big partner of mine because overall we want customers to be calling into our CS department versus the credit card company. So building great relationships with these other areas within the company is definitely, of course, challenging because you're asking them to help do more work while still, ensuring that your program is still going forward.
One change that I can add that I've seen over the past few years is that there's been a change in the expectations of legitimate users. From the risk modeling and detection perspective, 5 years ago when we worked in fraud sciences, if you suspected someone to be a fraudster, then limiting them and having them wait for days and days on end to prove that they were not a fraudster or pass through your intricate authentication process was standard practice, at least for some segments of the market. And as the industry, as e-commerce becomes more and more sophisticated, even in the riskier segments in virtual goods, people expect to pay quickly, have a decision quickly, and be identified as good customers and not suffer from false positives and go into the grind of the risk department if they don't belong there.
Thanks, guys. So, as you pointed out, fraudsters have gotten much more sophisticated, and I'm sure the challenge can seem daunting, especially to a young company. So, could you tell the audience what you would recommend that they do in the early stages of their company, or if they have no fraud management practice at all, what are the initial steps that they can take to mitigate the risk?
I would recommend really dedicating resources, technology, and infrastructure to those efforts right from the beginning. You don't want to be in a situation where your product or your app gets traction and starts to scale, and then you start seeing issues with fraud, and then you have to go back and crack that open again and try to create detection and prevention methods. So first and foremost, develop technology from the get-go. I would also, it's very important for the merchant to, and this has already been stated a couple of times, is to know your customer. Understand what is considered normal activity and what is considered anomalous activity. And I'm talking in terms of sales volume, daily volume, monthly volume. Ask yourself the question, is this customer too good to be true? And if you have to spend a considerable amount of time to try to answer that question, then I would recommend increased scrutiny for that particular customer. So I would also say that you have to know your customer in terms of where are they accessing from, where are they listed in terms of their payment method, where do they appear to be coming from. For example, if you have a customer who is listed in Illinois and they're accessing from an IP address in Vietnam, I would recommend increased scrutiny for that particular customer. So it's definitely a layered effect. There are several different layers that you have to implement, but first and foremost, implement those layers right from the beginning and don't wait till it's too late.
Yeah, to add to that, there's like a lot of basic rules out there that are just obvious. So for instance, for the online gaming, for us, there's a lot of regulations to be doing business in China. And so overall, we should not be seeing any transactions coming from China. So we actually block any IPs coming from China. And before I joined, that rule wasn't even in place. And it was a huge amount of IPs coming in from China doing transactions, even though we were not supposed to. And so when we started blocking IPs from China, the fraud actually went down quite a bit. So understanding where you do business, and in a sense, blocking out regions where you know you're not supposed to be seeing transactions coming from, helps quite a bit as well too. And then implementing some of the basic rules such as bin checks. If the credit card was issued in the U.S. and you see some guy coming in from Russia, or Germany making these transactions, and then the next minute he's coming in from the U.S. again, kind of raises a red flag. So there's a lot of basic rules that you could implement early on.
If there's one thing I can add, or maybe to echo some of the things that you guys said, risk management should be treated as a technology problem. Technology, classification, a problem that you need to invest in, not by, as I said, not just by throwing bodies at the problem. Because we could sit here for days, laying out standard rules that you need to implement. Fraud and user behavior in general is something that evolves and changes. And if the team that you seed and grow to deal with risk management and business analytics in general doesn't know how to deal with these changes, then you will be chasing your tail. And starting from this realization and hiring the right people is a cornerstone in dealing with risk management.
Great, thanks guys. We're going to open it up for audience questions now. So if you just raise your hand, I'll point you out. Say your question. Please state it in the form of a question. I'll repeat it and then we'll pose it to these guys. Yes, right here. Okay, so the question is, when did the 3 to 4 months of fraud begin? Was it when you started your online business, or did it take some time to develop? Was that it?
Yeah, it was definitely the online business. And then there's certain games that are geared towards more fraud, such as like those MMO games, like World of Warcraft, that's out there right now. We make games similar to that as well too. And so, but mainly when we started the online business, that's when fraud started to occur.
Okay.
Also, what did you do about it? Did you disable their accounts or disable the game somehow?
I didn't hear that.
Oh, so he was asking
You can
about
repeat it
how,
also.
what do we do in regards to the accounts? Do we disable accounts and such? And yes, we do. So once we identify a fraudster, we disable any access to our servers and their account. So overall, for all of our games, we still have, in a sense, a hold within the game. So anytime, a lot of the games right now are online based. So if you want to play multiplayer, you got to log on to our servers. If you want to play a game that has fictional currency, you have to log on to our servers. So anytime we get any kind of activity that looks like you're a fraudster, we will actually disable your account, and then we force you to call our CS department. And more so than not, the fraudsters don't do that.
Yeah, on the side here.
So you were talking about sharing, being responsible as a vendor for the fraud as well. What type of story is there in terms of sharing with PayPal? Things like, hey, this transaction is fraudulent.
Okay, so the question is, we talked about sharing information as a vendor. What kind of sharing is there from PayPal in terms of the transaction is fraudulent? Right. Right. So I think maybe I'll answer that one. So I think actually you're hitting on something where PayPal is looking to be really forward-looking in terms of stuff that what I would call some of our next generation stuff that we would like to see develop with digital goods, and we're spending a lot of time thinking about that, of how that information sharing can take place. Because I think there's a tremendous opportunity here that actually doesn't exist in a lot of ways in the physical world, where we can pass that information. So as of yet, like what you can always do is, we have risk operations manager based out of Omaha, and you can speak with them and share information with them, and what you'll get back from them is some best practices that you can follow. But you're hitting on something that we really want to focus on in the foreseeable future.
Yeah, if I could just add to that quickly too. One core recommendation I would have is you don't want to be in a situation where you're trying to make a determination as to whether or not something fraudulent is happening, and making an educated decision on whether or not to terminate a relationship with a customer without having a considerable amount of data at your fingertips that will help you make that educated decision. So one of the things that I highly recommend is to ensure that you obtain a proper or an appropriate level of PCI compliance that allows you to store customer information that you would then be able to use to make an educated decision as to whether or not the customer could be perpetrating fraud.
Great. Over here.
This session is about combating fraud for the sale of digital goods. What are some of the major differences between fraud in the digital goods world compared to the tangible goods?
So the question is what are some of the major differences that you see between combating fraud in the physical world versus digital goods?
I could probably help answer that since we do both. In the physical goods, when we're shipping things out, we could delay that, approval, an hour, 2 hours, half a day, whenever we want. In the digital market, it's all about instant gratification. So to delay a entitlement for digital goods for more than 30 seconds is an eternity. So the idea is that we always want to make sure that the customer experience is great. So we always have to do instant gratification for digital goods, which does mean that if you have a good manual review team to review and to flag, and a system to flag transactions that are fraudulent, you have to give them the product first. And hopefully that if it's an online system and you still have control of their account, that you can always remove it later on. So it's more of a reactive process that, we have to entail first to ensure the customer experience is great. And then I have a team, a 24/7 team, that manages and monitors transactions that are flagged by our system. And so within about an hour or two, they'll realize that if this was a fraudulent transaction, which then they'll disable the account, and hopefully the currency or entitlement hasn't left yet. So, but physical products, you have time to review it and decide before you ship out.
If I may
Tim.
add just one thing, because you need a shipping address for tangible goods, the barrier for entry to commit fraud is higher. Once the barrier for entry is higher, scalability from the fraud perspective for the fraudster is harder. So obviously you attract a lot more people who are more technology savvy and know how to scale their fraud business to intangible goods. So the technology and the actual detection challenge is harder in intangible goods as well, relative to tangible goods.
Tim, over in the corner here.
I just wanted to add to that too, is that also the merchants don't offer very much protection for digital goods versus a shipped product. So if you ship it, you have a lot more protections from Visa, MasterCard, and PayPal than you do if you're a digital product.
Yeah. So what Tim just added there is there's more protection in the physical world, and so that provides obviously you guys with some protection if you're dealing with physical goods. With digital goods, the protections around that are still developing. Right here in the front.
It sounds like you watch IP address with your customers all the time. So do you just look for a pattern change, or if a person logs in at the same IP address and you change, do you trigger on that, or what's the is it highly recommended to watch IP addresses for your customers?
So the question is around IP addresses and what are you looking for with changes in patterns for IP addresses? What are some of the best practices when you're dealing with IP addresses? How do you utilize that information?
We use IP address checks all day, every day. The problem is that they're not always accurate. Internet service providers will change IP addresses, and with companies like AOL, they all seem to be coming from one location, appear to be coming from one location. So they can be a reasonable indicator, but they're not always accurate. We do checks based on IP, but in addition to that, we also use like their credit card information, what state they're listed in. Did we see a change with the region of the IP address location in comparison to where the method of payment information may be listed at? I think the point is that it's generally a layered approach. There's no one stop solution for any of this. It has to be several different layers in order for it to be effective.
What sort of procedures or tools have you seen in the case of a merchant that sells very low margin products, just that one order that's a total loss will wipe out all the gains made at 100 other orders, so that's where prevention is essential.
So the question is, what are some of the prevention mechanisms and tools you've seen for very low margin products where a loss on any one transaction could actually wipe out a significant amount of profit that you made?
If your margin is very, very low, you could consider going to a closed-door system where you authenticate users upfront instead of letting the order through and then trying to detect fraud. It doesn't render completely different tools. It just means that the way you build your funnel and the way you operate your order processing is different. It gives you more time to review. It gives you more time to communicate with the user. And it allows for higher scrutiny. There's also, obviously, when you start a risk operation, you have cost questions, right? How do you justify the cost of the risk operation compared to the money you save and your margin? But that's definitely one approach that you can take. If you don't go that route, then you have to be very, very accurate. That's a completely different discussion.
In the back there, and speak up in the blue shirt. So the question is, people go to jail when they steal physical goods and they defraud someone for physical goods. How up to date is legislation, regulation, what have you, around fraud with digital goods and the penalties related to that?
Well, I'm not an attorney, so I really can't speak specific to legislation. But what I can say is that a lot of it depends on how you present the case to law enforcement. So if there is activity that's been going on for a significant amount of time and there's malicious intent involved, and you can prove to law enforcement that there's a significant amount of dollar loss involved as well, there's a good chance that you would be able to get that case picked up by law enforcement. But I think a lot of it just depends on your approach, how much data you have, how much you're looking at in terms of dollar losses.
Yeah, we actually do work with the FBI and Homeland Security and the Cybercrime Division. I don't know about the law itself of how that's coming along, but it is an area that they are looking at.
Okay, down in front.
Best way to reject someone?
You mean a transaction?
Yeah, well, let's say there's a 30% chance that it's, based on some rough IP address heuristics. You've got some ideas there. You don't want to blacklist their IP, but aside from completely locking them out of an account, won't work as well as far as actions you can take.
Got it. I think the question is, what's the best way to reject someone? So if you see anomalous activity on their account, how do you handle that? Maybe what are some of the best practices around that? So, yeah, especially when it's not 100% sure, which I'm sure we'll hear from the panelists. It's never 100% sure, but I'll let them go ahead with that.
Be proactive in terms of reaching out to the customer. I had a situation just last week where we had a particular player who spent an anomalous amount of money in a 24-hour period. So first of all, that player came to our attention because it reached a set threshold that we had in place, and we received an alert about this activity. And what we did, we weren't exactly sure what was going on. To be quite honest, it didn't appear to be fraudulent activity on the face, but the exposure, especially in terms of buyer's remorse and friendly fraud, was very real. So we decided to just make contact with the player through our customer service department. So it's always better to use them as opposed to trying to contact them from the fraud department, because that just sends the wrong signal. So our customer service department reached out to the player via email. And just to give you an example of how this played out, we didn't hear from the player for a couple of days. And then so our next step was to suspend the account to elicit a response from the player. So the thought being, if this is a legitimate player spending this amount of money on our site, this is a player that is very interested in the product. And if you suspend that player, although it's not a perfect resolution, the chances of that player reaching out to you are very good if it's a legitimate customer. And if we didn't hear from this particular player, we would have strongly considered refunding those transactions and being proactive at that point. As it turns out, this player was a legitimate player. We heard from her shortly after the account was suspended, and it turns out that once we got the approach was. Tell us about your experience. What did you think of the application? What do you think of the games? And so on and so forth. And we were able to spin it as a customer service reach out. And then, a lot of our players are very, very happy when they hear that we have efforts to thwart and be proactive in regards to fraud. So the feedback that we got from this player turned out to be positive in the end.
Yeah, and it really depends on, I guess, the product you're selling as well too. For us, if there were transactions coming in that was kind of in that gray area, for us, we'll just give you the product first and then do a manual review later on. Since for us, the margins are kind of high. I mean, it's just a virtual couch. And so, if you're talking about, I think as you mentioned, with very low margins, like if you talk about electronics or jewelry, then I think you may need to go into as you mentioned, more contact to the customer and so forth.
Generally, one approach that I really like is changing the user experience for users you suspect, challenging them, adding more steps to the process. It might seem like it's not the optimal user experience for users you don't suspect, but if you suspect them, you should add steps to the checkout process. Which steps depends on what type of suspicion that behavior arose.
Okay, right here in front.
What are your thoughts on use in place for strong or verified identity in the industry?
Can you repeat that?
So using strong identity or verified identity in those transactions would probably avert some of the fraud. And I wonder, what are your thoughts? What are your plans? Is there space in there?
So the question is, what are the panelists' thoughts around using strong identity, verified identity, in order to thwart these attacks?
We personally, when a player becomes a member on our site, we capture a significant amount of information from the player's computer that we use for two reasons. One, it helps us with issues of friendly fraud, but also if down the road we have a circumstance that requires us to close an account, if this particular player were to try to create another account, we have that information stored in our system. So I'm not quite sure if that answers your question, but we try to be as proactive as we can when it comes to storing and using customer information.
For us, it almost makes no difference. I mean, it's so cheap to buy a full identity with your address, full name, mother's maiden name and everything out there, that trying to capture all the information almost doesn't make that big of a difference for us. I mean, we've seen accounts that put, their full information in there, and it still turned out to be fraud.
So my question was more about using trusted third party.
So the question was more about using trusted third party.
Yeah, we've looked into several third parties. I think what we're finding is that although the solutions are effective, we're not seeing that the third parties have other people in our space in their community. So, for example, if they're using device reputation or reputation manager products, it's helpful to know if a particular device is involved with fraudulent activity at jcrew.com, but it doesn't necessarily apply to our space. So although we've looked into third parties, we're finding that the community of merchants that they're involved with aren't necessarily involved in our space, and that's been our difficulty at this point.
Yeah.
Anything to add, Ohad?
The one thing I'd like to repeat: if there's a mean to identify that a specific identity exists, meaning that the name, address, phone, etc., belong to a real person in the world, it's kind of interesting, but it doesn't solve the authentication problem of whether the user you're dealing with right now is really the person they claim to be. Right? So you can verify an identity, but you cannot authenticate it. And if that's what you're referring to, then it's not necessarily solving a basic problem. If on the other hand you were talking about this kind of a solution, so a sophisticated blacklist, most of the times it allows for some kind of order filtering, but these things change a lot. Fraudsters change the resources they use very, very frequently, and not having a broad enough basis of data for the service is a very common problem, as was noted here.
So actually, we're running low on time here. I'm getting the hook. So there are some of these items that we touched on, and I'll put this slide up. So hopefully on the webcast you can go back and take a look at the presentation, and then we also have a best practices fraud management guide, which is on our PayPal Digital Goods microsite that you guys can take a look at. Yeah, and we'll be distributing it. So. I think the last point we want to make is, when things go wrong, remember when you can refund, right? The closer the dispute gets resolved to you, as opposed to, making it upstream to the payment provider or whoever it may be, the better. Understand what happened, and fraud is a part of your business. That's just the unfortunate truth. So don't overreact. And try to be proactive in dealing with it as opposed to reactive. So, we will be here for questions, I think, but also the keynote will be starting shortly, so you might want to make your way up there. But the panelists have offered to stay behind. I think, Nelson, you want to make a final point?
Just one quick thing. I mean, you don't have to be selling products to actually get defrauded. I've been working with nonprofit organizations as well too, where really they don't sell anything. They just collect donations, and fraudsters are attacking them just to check out if the validity of the credit card, which in turn later they get chargebacks for as well too. So if you do any kind of transaction whatsoever, there's potential for being defrauded in one way or another.
So I'll hang behind for questions, and then an excellent resource for questions about fraud is actually Ohad's blog, which is up there, and you can talk to him after the fact. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
That upstairs.